Years ago, I read the short story A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel García Márquez. I'll never forget that story. The reason this story stuck with me was the feel of it. I didn't know it at the time, but the feel of that story was created by a literary device called Magical Realism. It's where magical elements are incorporated into realistic settings. In Magical Realism, the extraordinary or the supernatural is presented as an integral, everyday part of the world, and characters typically accept these fantastical elements without question. I think this is important. Stories wherein this device is used may be trying to remind us, secular modernists, that perhaps we do in fact live in a world where the magical and the mundane coexist seamlessly. We are just no longer any good at seeing the magical. Magical realism can be found in many cultures, but it's most closely associated with Latin American literature. The term magical realism, or realismo magico, was first used by German art critic Franz Roh in 1925 to describe the style of painting that portrayed real objects in a surreal way. But it was later applied to literature by Latin American writers and critics. In the mid-20th century, there was a lot of social and political upheaval going on in Latin America. Post-colonial struggles and the search for national identities. Magical realism, in part, is a response to these conditions. It was perhaps a way to express complex and even contradictory realities of life when you lived in a society that was shaped by colonialism, indigenous cultures, and modernization. And don't forget Christianity. Except in the modern West, Christianity gives us a world where reality is understood in a greater spiritual, magical context. Lastly, the development of magical realism was also influenced by European surrealism. Surrealism sought to explore the unconscious and the irrational. So Latin American writers took all these ideas and merged them with their own cultural traditions and folklore and myths. Let's dig a little bit more into why they did this. For one thing, magical realism could reflect the tension between indigenous worldviews and European rationalism. Both of these are a big part of Latin American societies. By blending the magical with the real, writers could wrestle with and challenge Western notions of reality and truth. Another reason for the use of this device is that it allowed authors to critique authoritarian regimes and social injustices indirectly. The fantastical elements provided a layer of protection so that the writers could address controversial topics without getting into trouble. Latin America is characterized by a blending of indigenous, African, and European cultures. Magical realism reflects this syncretism because it depicts the world where multiple belief systems and realities coexist. So who are the main authors and books that employ magical realism? Well, Gabriel García Márquez could be considered the father of magical realism, and his novel 100 Years of Solitude is one of the most famous examples. The novel tells the multiple generational story of the Buendia family in the fictional town of Macondo, where the miraculous and the mundane are inextricably linked. So here's an example of magical realism from this book. Remedios the Beauty is both stunningly beautiful and is childlike in her innocence, and she's largely oblivious to the attention her beauty attracts. One day, while she's helping with the mundane task of folding laundry with the other women in the family, she suddenly begins to rise into the sky, taking the sheet she is holding up with her. Without any warning or clear explanation, she ascends directly into heaven, leaving everyone around her in awe. The scene is described with a sense of calm acceptance by the other characters, even though it is a completely miraculous and inexplicable event. The other women watch her go, unable to stop her as she disappears into the clouds and is never seen or heard from again. This miraculous event is presented in a matter-of-fact way, which is typical of magical realism, and it's one of many in the novel, where the magical and the real are seamlessly intertwined. The miraculous is part of the everyday fabric of life. Other prominent authors using this device are Jorge Luis Borges, Isabel Allende, Juan Rulfo, and Alejo Carpentier. Magical realism has found expression in popular culture as well. Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel uses magical realism to explore the connection between food, emotion, and tradition in a Mexican family. Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie is a landmark in magical realism. It blends Indian history with fantastical elements. And Beloved by Toni Morrison. This novel incorporates elements of magical realism to tell the haunting story of a former slave and her family. And here are a few movies that are examples of magical realism. Pan's Labyrinth from 2006. Pan's Labyrinth was directed by Guillermo del Toro. It juxtaposes the brutal realities of post-Civil War Spain with a young girl's fantastical experiences in a magical labyrinth. The Secret of Rowan Inish was directed by John Sayles. It uses magical realism to tell the story of a young girl who discovers her family's mystical connection to the seals around her island home in Ireland. And The Shape of Water, also directed by Guillermo del Toro. This film blends magical realism with romance and Cold War-era political intrigue. It's about a mute woman who falls in love with a fishman creature. What I like about magical realism is that it asks us to consider or reconsider our understanding of reality. Perhaps if we look at reality with a different lens, it becomes infused with magic. Perhaps the extraordinary is a natural part of life, and we are just blind to it. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.